Good morning, guys. It's 10 past 9 on the 17th of November 2017, and welcome to podcast number 18, which is the first in the next series of podcasts which are going to focus on the Hermetic view of the process of creation. So the first thing I need to do here before we get into the subject properly is I need to provide two introductions to subjects that are necessary to understand before we start discussing serious alchemical ideas. So this 18th podcast, the first one in this series, is going to be an introduction to the idea of what alchemy is. And I believe we need this introduction because there are a great many misunderstandings about what alchemy actually is, what the nature of alchemy is, what alchemists believe, and what they are involved in. So this podcast hopefully is going to dispel some of those misunderstandings, the important ones, and to provide you with some accurate information about the actual nature of the alchemical tradition in the Western esoteric culture. So the first thing we need to understand is, contrary to widespread popular opinion in the mainstream level of Hermetism, Western occultism, is that there actually is a valid, historic, alchemical laboratory tradition. A lot of people get confused about this since the advent of modern psychology and Carl Jung's involvement in developing his own psychological system, Jungian analysis, where he became involved in the study of classical alchemical texts and interpreted those texts in the format of human psychology. A lot of people since his time have then believed that alchemy is not a laboratory tradition, that somehow that was a misunderstanding or a deliberate lie or a falsification of the alchemical tradition, and that in fact alchemy is a form of human psychology. And Western occultists have taken that basic belief and extended it a little bit further and have said that alchemy is an esoteric teaching where psychology is concerned, a form of esoteric psychology, and that is it. That the laboratory tradition is not really valid at all. And this belief, apart from the fact that it's grown out of Jungian analysis, this belief hangs on the idea held by many modern Western pop occultists that there can't be anything spiritual about physical matter, physical substances, and therefore chemicals, and so therefore a chemical approach to alchemy must be in some shape or form either a deliberate deception or a misunderstanding or a lie. But most pop occultists, if they know anything at all about classic alchemy, if they've read any classic alchemical texts, they can't help but agree that there is something valid in those texts, that they obviously conceal some kind of a secret tradition. But since they can't understand how manipulating physical matter, in common terminology chemistry, how chemistry or manipulating physical matter could somehow be connected with spiritual issues, spiritual development, with magic or mysticism, then they automatically write off the idea that there is a valid alchemical tradition, laboratory tradition. So the first problem we need to be completely definite about and provide a proper, reasonable argument for is the claim by alchemists themselves that the laboratory tradition is not only valid in a historical sense and in a contemporary sense, but that the laboratory tradition is intimately connected with esoteric tradition, with spiritual development, with the concept of magic, and with Hermetism and its philosophy. We need to explain how that actually works. How is a form of esoteric chemistry related to the subject of spiritual development? So the core idea that we need to grasp in order to understand how something physical can be involved in the spiritual tradition, the core idea that we need to grasp in order to understand that is actually very simple. Hermetic philosophy teaches that the reality that we live in, which I refer to as binary reality, because the basis of this reality at the physical end of the mechanism is a binary mechanism. What Hermetism teaches is that this binary reality has its root in one thing, in unity reality, in a unified source. And therefore, all of the rules, all of the natural laws and conditions which govern our reality are present in that unified source. They begin there. The laws which govern our reality didn't suddenly appear when our reality appeared. Those laws existed before our reality existed. And those laws tell our reality how to unfold and how to be structured and how to function as our reality is created. So, a single unified source gives rise to two things, a binary reality. Therefore, each pole of that binary reality contains and has in common the rules and laws and conditions that are inherent in the unified source. To put that more simply, our physical reality being binary, in its simplest form, the simplest way of looking at this binary is that it is part physical and part non-physical. All of us conscious thinking human beings are aware of this, that part of our reality is physical and part of it is non-physical or psychological, mental, or if you want to use a more traditional term, spiritual, because the term spiritual is simply an old label for what we now refer to as the human psyche or the mind. So our binary reality is made up of a physical side and a non-physical or mental side. And therefore, Hermetism teaches us that the essential laws which govern physical reality are the same as the essential natural laws that govern the mind. And one of the motives behind the existence of alchemy as a learning tool is to demonstrate the reality of this claim, that physical matter and non-physical existence are rooted in the same system, in the same plan, and they are based on the same natural laws. Alchemy is designed to demonstrate this fact, not simply to explain intellectually how that might be the case, but to show you things about physical existence that will lead you to intellectually be able to grasp from physical experiment that the concept of the mind and the body being rooted in the same natural laws is a natural fact, and therefore that Hermetism is validated in teaching that this is a natural fact. So what this means in practical terms is that it is not only possible to develop yourself spiritually through inner practices such as meditation or the core system behind magic and ceremonial or ritual, but it is also possible to approach spiritual development through a physical medium such as esoteric chemistry. So it helps to understand from a historic point of view what kinds of individuals were involved in the study and practice of laboratory alchemy. And these kinds of individuals can be divided into three categories. The first category is the most common kind of person that historically has been involved in alchemy, and I refer to them as the capitalist category. These are people who came to alchemy simply because of the legendary claims made about the elixir of life and about producing gold. These people don't care about alchemy per se. They certainly don't care about the esoteric side of alchemy. All they want is the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life for commercial purposes, or in order to extend their own life. In other words, to profit off alchemy. So historically, most people, especially in the Western world, who have been attracted to laboratory alchemy and its study and practice are people who only cared about wanting gold or wanting to extend their lives. And if they studied or practiced anything about the esoteric side of alchemy, they only did so because they believed that was what was necessary to get their hands on the goods, which was transmutation in order to make gold, or the elixir of life in order to rejuvenate themselves. So I call this first category the capitalist category. And like I said, most people involved in alchemy in the past belong to this category. And this is why there are a lot of misconceptions about the nature of alchemy and laboratory alchemy and what it actually means, is because when we look at alchemy historically, most of the subject matter that we have to study revolves around the people who were not really interested in alchemy at all, but were trying to capitalize on it, trying to profit off it. The second category of people are people who are interested in laboratory alchemy because of its ability to give us access to transmutation and rejuvenation, but they also considered themselves to be occultists. They were interested in the esoteric side of alchemy, but because they have not been initiated into that side of alchemy, they don't actually have access to the proper esoteric side of the alchemical tradition, which is by far the hardest information about alchemy to get access to, both historically and today. So these people are kind of in a middle ground. They want the esoteric knowledge and information, and they want the benefits of the spiritual side of the alchemical tradition, but because they don't have access to the proper esoteric tradition, they end up becoming heavily immersed in the lab tradition, which they also never properly understand. So while their intentions are good, their practice largely is materialistic because of no fault of their own. So they're in a halfway kind of an area. This portion of people make up about 50% of modern occultists, in my opinion. Most modern alchemists, students of alchemy, who we would bump into on forums or at workshops or as part of organisations that teach alchemy, belong to this category. They want the esoteric side, but they have no real idea how to access it, or they believe they have it and they don't actually have it, and so they spend a lot of time mucking about with lab gear and chemicals, hoping that they are doing alchemy, but they are hopelessly trapped in a very materialistic view of the subject. The third category of people involved in the laboratory alchemy tradition are those who are initiated, who actually have access to the true esoteric, the authentic esoteric tradition associated with alchemy, and they only practice laboratory alchemy as an adjunct to and as a benefit toward their personal spiritual development. Where this group of people are concerned, this category of people are concerned, they are by far the minority of people who are studying alchemy. They are probably only in the realm of 1 or 2% of the people who study alchemy, historically and presently today. So there is a kind of a common axiom which is bandied about this third category and this minority group within the community of students of alchemy, and that is that the true aim, the true goal and purpose of studying laboratory alchemy is not the production of gold, but it is the higher development of the alchemist himself. In other words, the true goal of laboratory alchemy is to aid the alchemist in transmuting himself and finding his own metaphorical gold within. So an important thing to understand from the concept of these three categories of people is that a lot of the stuff you might read or study about alchemy is produced by people who don't have access to the esoteric tradition, or who simply don't want access to the esoteric tradition. And this is particularly true today, although we can see from the writings of historic adepts that they said the same things often about their own times, that most of the people that they bumped into and discussed alchemy with were in the first category, people who didn't care about the esoteric tradition, that they were deluded because of that, and that they were only interested in gold and or extending their life expectancy. What we also might learn from the fact that these three categories of people exist is that in order to find an accurate understanding of what alchemy is really about, we have to learn to discern the difference between category 1 and 2 literature and people who have written from the perspective of the third category, the minority, the people who actually knew and understood what alchemy was really about. And for all intents and purposes, the easiest access that you can get to that third rare category of alchemists who understood the esoteric tradition, the best compilation of texts in this category that we have access to today. They aren't all in this category, but the bulk of them in this compilation is in a book by A.E. Waite called the Hermetic Museum. It was originally published in 2 volumes, but now you can usually buy it in a single volume. And what Waite did was, I think he based his edition of the Hermetic Museum on a previous edition, but he did a lot of editing and chopping and changing, and he gathered together what he believed were the best alchemical texts from the golden age of alchemy, which was largely the Renaissance and the early pre-Renaissance period. He gathered together what he considered to be the best texts, which not only were accurate information about simple practical laboratory work, but which also combined Hermetic philosophy, where it was associated with alchemy, and a lot of information about the spiritual side of alchemy, the self-development side. Although, when we take the Hermetic Museum as a collection of texts and study them carefully, we will find that even though it is very obvious that the men who wrote these texts had a deeply spiritual background to their alchemical study, they don't give away a lot of the secrets. That in the past, as today, the spiritual development side of alchemy is still the most secret part of the Western Hermetic tradition. And even amongst occultists, probably only 1% of occultists have any real idea about what authentic Hermetic alchemical self-development even looks like. So now we have our first 2 important concepts to grasp about alchemy. That it actually is possible, that it actually is valid, that there is a valid historic tradition within the overall Western Hermetic tradition, which focuses on a physical approach to spiritual self-development instead of an internal approach. It is valid. And one of the curious things about this is that while alchemy is one of the least understood subjects in the Western Hermetic tradition, if we gather together all of the books written about alchemy and all of the books written about magic, historically speaking, and that we understand that alchemy and magic are the 2 primary streams of Western Hermetic teaching and practice, before the turn of the 19th century into the 20th century, by far the vast bulk of Western occult literature was books on alchemy. That in fact, for most of the Western Hermetic tradition's history, there have been, relatively speaking, very few books written on magic. And I'm not saying that this means that those books are less valid or anything like that. I'm just talking about volume here. When we weigh up all of the literature in the historic Western Hermetic tradition, the bulk, by far, of texts that were written on Western occult subjects were written on alchemy. Even today, in the famous libraries of Europe, and to a certain degree in the old libraries and national libraries of the United States, if we go hunting for Hermetic literature, most of it is in the alchemical tradition. And the funny thing is that more is believed to be understood about magic today than alchemy, but alchemy has the lion's share of information connected with its own personal stream, which shows that even though we have a huge quantity of historic alchemical literature, virtually nothing is understood about it. and that approaching the end of the 16th century into the 1600s and 1700s, slowly the alchemical tradition became so misunderstood and so ignored that eventually almost nothing was known about it. And at one time, adepts who actually understood the true alchemical tradition must have been very rare individuals, belonging to either deeply underground organizations or working alone on their own, passing their knowledge on to very few selected individuals. So that's the first part of the view and philosophy of alchemy that we need to understand, that there is a valid historic alchemical laboratory tradition that is focused ultimately on the self-development of the spiritual self-development of the alchemist. And I'm going to go in later podcasts into detail about what that actually is, how it is that laboratory alchemy gets you into a spiritual self-development stream. But for now, I'm going to explain the basic philosophy behind how that works. And that is that alchemists teach that because physical matter and the non-physical condition of our binary reality have come from the same source, where all the rules for our reality are stored, that if we reverse engineer physical matter, that at the heart of physical matter there are substances, and most particularly there is a substance in particular which contains all of the magical properties, for want of a better description, that the unified substance, that the unified source of reality gifts to binary reality. In other words, when the unified source of reality first divides itself to become binary reality, at the root of that binary mechanism are the magical properties inherent in physical reality. So for example, when we look at internal methods of self-development, we can easily understand that at the root of our internal condition we find a state which is commonly referred to as the higher self. That is the divine part of ourselves, the total summit of our internal mountain. So at the very root of what we are, we find the magical properties that were gifted to us from the ultimate divine source. Alchemists teach that the same thing is true about physical matter. If we reverse engineer physical matter using alchemical method, we eventually come to a substance which is at the core of all physical matter, and that substance contains the magical properties which govern physical reality and were inherited from the one thing source. The next thing which alchemists teach us about this core substance and its magical properties is that it is the thing that alchemists use to produce all the various alchemical medicines or remedies or products that alchemists are so obsessed with manufacturing in their laboratories. And the two most important of all of these various alchemical products are, of course, the Philosopher's Stone and the elixir of long life. So alchemists teach that this root substance, which they say is everywhere and in everything and contains the powers of God, when it is converted into the philosopher's stone, then that substance can speedily evolve anything that it is merged with or mingled with. And that this act, which we call in the mineral kingdom transmutation, is a physical demonstration of the inherent powers of the divine, which are evolutionary and beneficial. They are a universal panacea, which means they heal everything, right all wrongs, balance all disharmonies. And the elixir of life is simply the version of this hermetic catalyst, which is designed to be ingested by human beings, for example, and it produces rejuvenation in biological systems. And rejuvenation is simply the same mechanism as metallic transmutation, but applied to the realm of biology. Same mechanism. So alchemists desire to achieve the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life because for them it is the ultimate empirical proof, not only that a unified something exists at the root of all existence, but that that this unified condition possesses very specific properties which can be captured, measured and demonstrated by an adept, by an alchemical adept. Just watching in the viewfinder of my camera, I hope this shadow is not too distracting. It's early in the morning and the sun's low, so it's hard for me here to find a place with decent lighting, but I think it's not going to make much of a difference to the dialogue here, which is the important thing. I'm not the important thing. So, why do alchemists seek the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life? Because to them it is the ultimate proof of Hermetic philosophy. Because of this fact, alchemical adepts for a long time through the history of the alchemical tradition have referred to alchemy as the Hermetic science. They consider alchemy as being the root of all Hermetism, the root of astrology, of ritual, of divination, of magic, of alchemical theory. It all comes back in the end to alchemy, because alchemy proves empirically how the physical universe, or how our reality, physical and non-physical, is constructed out of a unified source, and what laws and rules and natural inclinations are inherent in that single source and manifest in our physical reality. It's all about proof. One of the reasons why many people in mainstream occultism don't grasp this aspect of alchemy is that there is a long-standing tradition in popular occultism that nothing can be proved where esoteric things are concerned. It's all about belief and faith. The moment we even begin to consider the possibility that spiritual realities might somehow be able to be calculated, measured, weighed and rationally discussed, most people at the popular level of the esoteric tradition will aggressively refute that entire argument. But the truth of the matter is that the laboratory tradition itself is founded on and demonstrates this approach to Western Hermetism as being an actual fact, and not only as being an actual fact, but being essential to maintaining the integrity of authentic Hermetic teaching, which is why, for example, the Rosicrucians of the 15th and 16th century rooted most of their teaching and philosophy in the alchemical Hermetic tradition, because they knew that they could physically in their laboratories demonstrate and prove all of the principles which they taught in their philosophies. So it shouldn't be hard to grasp, if you understand this much, that everything about the claims that Hermetic Alchemy makes about itself rely on the premise that transmutation, alchemical transmutation, that means high yield ambient condition transmutation, is a fact. If high yield ambient condition transmutation is not a fact, then the entire argument of the Hermetic tradition falls apart. Everything which the old adepts of the medieval and Renaissance period of Hermetism taught was rooted in the premise that the Philosopher's Stone is a fact and that transmutation is a fact. This is why the argument of whether or not historic claims about transmutation, having succeeded in it, are fact or not, is a point of serious contention, not only for modern science, chemistry and physics in particular, but also for occultists in the mainstream tradition themselves. They either want to believe in the reality of transmutation or they don't, depending on what their personal motive is when it comes to defending their own point of view about Hermetism. So all of these concepts, an understanding of the teaching of classic Hermetism about the source of our reality, and the theory and philosophy behind the purpose of alchemy as a teaching, and the existence and reality of transmutation agents and rejuvenation, biological rejuvenation, lies at the very heart of the alchemical tradition and what it is supposed to mean to alchemists themselves. So if we grasp this much, the concepts revolving around the nature of creation, how Hermetism teaches that our reality is a binary reality which has its source in a unified state, and that this means therefore that the physical and the non-physical sides of our reality have a spiritual aspect to them, and by spiritual that means they are rooted in a unified state, and that therefore there is a grand unified theory about the nature of reality in Hermetic teaching, and that by extension these ideas as the core of Hermetic philosophy lead in practice to the belief or the fact that transmutation agents can be constructed from physical matter and used to force transmutation in the mineral metallic realm, kingdom, and that they also provide us access to biological rejuvenatives, the elixir of long life. All of these concepts are central to the Hermetic paradigm, to the Hermetic alchemical paradigm, and that alchemists themselves believe that all of these core key ideas are central to the most important teachings of the Hermetic tradition itself, and that therefore everything else that we commonly accept as part of the Hermetic tradition, such things as tarot, astrology, Hermetic astronomy, Hermetic psychology, Kabbalah, the way ritual and ceremonial works, the mechanisms of magic, that all of these things essentially rely on the core concepts and principles of Hermetic philosophy, which are derived from alchemical experiment. So I think, as far as defining what alchemy is, I've said probably enough on that subject for one podcast. Hopefully what I've said provides an adequate amount of reasonable argument. Whether it's true or not is not important at the moment. All we want to understand at this point is how alchemists see things and why they do what they do. Alchemists decompose or reverse engineer substances in order to find a thing at their core which they believe contains special properties, which they believe then allow them to demonstrate the essential divine nature of physical reality. And that then by extrapolation, that model, that physical model of the divine nature of reality can be applied to the mind and show us that the mind and the body are based on the same rules, and also show us what the rules for evolving matter are, how they are expressed in the mind, and therefore become the process of initiation, esoteric psychology. So the next podcast number 19, is going to be another introduction, and it's going to be an introduction to the subject of a book called the Aura Catena Homeri, the Golden Chain of Homer, which is a famous alchemical text which I think was produced in the 1700s from memory, probably by a German Rosicrucian, close to the beginning of the Rosicrucian tradition, but certainly part of the deeply technical and highly developed German alchemical tradition of that period. It is considered to be one of the most important texts in modern alchemical tradition. When the famous modern alchemist Frate Albertus was asked if his house burnt down and he only had the time to grab one book from his library to save, what would it be? He said it would be the Golden Chain of Homer. I'm not sure whether I would agree with him, but certainly I can understand why he said that, because the Golden Chain of Homer is one of the few texts which, almost in a modern scientific format, describes the key ideas, the principal ideas behind which stand behind alchemical philosophy. And the discussion in the Golden Chain of Homer begins with a very technical discussion in a very kind of pseudo-scientific format of the nature of creation. And this is the part of that text which I'm going to discuss in the next, in this forthcoming podcast series. I'm not going to talk about the entire Golden Chain of Homer because it's lengthy and it's complicated, but we're going to focus on the beginning part of it, which is a few very small chapters, but which are very difficult to understand, which a lot of students of alchemy read and do not understand, and which virtually no students of Western occultism outside alchemy even realize exists, and the few that do realize it probably don't even really make an effort to read it or understand it. But it is a key essential text to understanding the root concepts of the ancient Hermetic tradition. And these ideas are presented in that text in probably one of the easiest and least cryptic ways of explaining how Hermetists back for thousands of years have understood the process of creation, and therefore how they understand the structure of physical and non-physical sides of our reality. In the same way that modern physicists at places like CERN are trying to deconstruct matter in order to understand the structure and nature and rules and dynamics of our physical existence, the ancient alchemists allegedly did the same thing. They deconstructed matter in order to understand the rules which govern our reality, and which are also inherent in both physical and non-physical sides of our reality. And they didn't begin supposedly with a spiritual point of view. The deconstructing of matter caused them to come to the conclusion in the end that the source of our reality is divine. This is an important concept. They didn't start off with a religious or spiritual attitude and therefore try to find a religious or spiritual explanation for our existence. They deconstructed physical reality and came to the conclusion, when they reached its core, that the source of our reality was divine. This is an important concept, and it's important particularly in our age because it's the same journey in a more in-depth and very materialistic approach that modern science is making itself. So, in the description box below, and I think here as well, for the hell of it, I will put the URL, the link to the Golden Chain of Homer, so you can download a copy and have a quick look at it before the next podcast. And in the next podcast, I'm going to talk about the background to this book before we actually start discussing the meaning of this book. If you download a copy and have a read of this book, you'll understand why it requires an explanation, because I think if you sit down and read it, especially if you have no background in alchemy yourself, laboratory alchemy, you'll find it very hard to understand exactly what it is that the author is trying to teach us. So the book needs a lot of explanation. It needs to be interpreted, especially for non-alchemical students. So in the description and here, that's a link to a website that has been started since almost the beginning of the internet by a guy called Adam McLean, the alchemy website, and he is a scholar. He's not an alchemist himself. He simply studies about alchemy, reads books and texts, and considers alchemical engravings and things like that, and so has collected as much information as he can get access to about the subject of alchemy. He's an academic, he's not a hermetist or an alchemist, and he's compiled the collection of all that information at that website, which is the largest source of classic alchemical literature on the internet, and of course that means he has a copy of the Golden Chain of Homer there. There is also another interesting version of the Golden Chain of Homer called the Rams edition, the Rare and Ancient Manuscript Society, the guys who used to collect very rare alchemical manuscripts and transcribe them into sort of semi-modern format during the 80s. That organisation no longer exists, but they produced one of the extended editions of the Golden Chain of Homer. But we'll discuss all that in the next podcast. So now, for now, thanks for watching again. What is the Golden Chain of Homer? Where did it come from? And what is its history as a book?